Greetings, this is M Squared, and today we are going to talk about sets of real numbers. There are different types of real numbers, so let's take a trip down memory lane and talk about all the numbers you've learned so far in your life. The first numbers that kids usually learn are when they're starting to count their toes or their fingers or something else, a little toy, and we always start with the number 1. Natural numbers, sometimes they're referred to as counting numbers. The variable that they're going to use for that abbreviation is n, and it starts with 1. They go on forever in one direction. And then you learn about the number 0 a little bit later in life, and the whole numbers, which are symbolized by the variable w, start at 0 and go on 1, 2, 3. So the only difference between natural numbers and whole numbers is the whole numbers adds the 0 in. Then we move up to integers. Later, when you're, about 3rd, 4th grade, somewhere in there, you start learning about negative numbers. So this set contains all of these, but in addition to that, gets negative numbers. And then we move on to rational numbers. You start learning about fractions and decimals. And so rational numbers include all of these, but they also include decimals, repeating decimals, terminating decimals, and fractions. But still, all of these, the number 5, which would be a natural number, a whole number, an integer, and a rational number, and a real number. So sometimes numbers can be in more than one set. So you've learned only real numbers. I don't think you learn all your numbers until this year in school. Probably Algebra 2 is when you learn all your numbers. You're going to go to complex numbers and you'll learn another irrational number too, called E. So let's talk about irrational numbers. Irrational numbers are decimals that do not have any repeating pattern and they do not end. And you've probably learned about pi, how pi goes on forever and ever and never repeats a pattern. These square roots are also irrational numbers. If you put a square root of 3 in your calculator, it goes until the digits stop and then it stops. The calculator rounds it off. But it doesn't mean it actually stops. It goes on and on forever and never repeats any pattern. And so we call that an irrational number. An irrational number cannot be written as a fraction or a ratio. You see this word ratio here in rational? All of these numbers can be written as ratios. So that's the difference between rational or ratio numbers and non-ratio numbers. So rational and irrational. Keep that in mind. I is what we use to abbreviate that there. Q here. And then real numbers. Sometimes it's a fancy little r, sometimes it's just r. But in your book, they'll give you some numbers and they'll ask you, what sets do these numbers belong to? Well, remember, it can only be, all of them are real numbers because you've only learned real numbers. So everything's going to be a real number. And then you have a choice between irrational and rational, and then integer, whole number, natural number. So let's start here. 2 is a natural number. But it's also, again, if it's natural, it's also whole, an integer, a rational number, and a real number. So we have to write all those. We have to write that it's real, that it's a rational number, that it's an integer, sorry, I'm messing up there, that it's a whole number, and then it's a natural number. So 2 is all of them. Negative 17 is not a natural number because it's negative. It's not a whole number because it's negative. Negatives start right here. So we know it's an integer, we know it's a rational number, and we know it's a real number. Now the square root of 25. If you don't know what the square root of 25 is, you need to put it in your calculator. The square root of 25 is equal to 5. So even though it's a square root, we don't say it's irrational because it can be written as a ratio. So anything that can be written as a ratio is a rational number. But since it's 5, that's a natural number. So again, it's all of them. It's real, rational, an integer, a whole number, and a natural number. So be careful with those square roots. Now this is a decimal. It's a repeating decimal. So it can't be any of these guys because it's a decimal. Decimals start here. Negatives start here. Decimals start here. So since it's a decimal and it repeats, we know it's rational and it's also real. Square root of 3, we just did that in the calculator a minute ago, so we know that that's irrational, but it's also real. And then negative 2/3, because it's a fraction, it can't be an integer, a whole number, or a natural number. So it's just a rational number and a real number. And hopefully that was helpful. Good luck figuring out what sets these numbers belong to. This is M Squared, signing out.